it happens in different ways. We sometimes have very, dense discussion with lots of questions really coming. But sometimes people, just thinking and processing the information they have heard. So it may be very different, really.
Well, we'll see. It's it's a
Yeah.
psychoanalytic perspective, and maybe that
Mhm.
will help, and maybe it will hurt. We'll find out.
Mhm. Thank you.
If I may, I can start. My name is Anton, and I will be moderating this event today.
Thank you. Thank you, Oksana. And again, I'm very pleased to have the chance to meet with you. So again, the title of my talk is War as an Assault on Transitional Space. And just to set the tone, November 11th of 2023 was the 105th anniversary of the end of World War I. And that war was really pivotal in the development of trauma theory and military combat stress control doctrine, two things I'll be talking about. Despite the biomedical reductionism of our time, at least in American psychiatry, everything is biological, it should be remembered that psychoanalysis played a key role in framing trauma theory and defining the principles of response, which continue to inform organizational and clinical interventions today. And this presentation represents my best effort uh, to personally understand the combat veterans that I've worked with clinically for the last 40 years. I hope that these thoughts will also help you think about what's going on in the room when you're working as a therapist with people who have lived through combat and other traumatic events. Uh, so let's talk a little about World War I. Modern military psychiatry, not just American, but all over the world, really begins with Thomas Salmon, a psychiatrist who engaged in that war. He's someone who joined the US Public Health Service back in 1903 and was an important advocate for the mentally ill. And because of that, he was asked to become the first executive director of the National Committee for Mental Hygiene in 1915. The National Committee for Mental Hygiene was a movement that partnered uh, doctors, academics, policymakers, and the public at large in a mass movement to improve mental health, to understand the problems, to track problems early, and solve them before they became major problems. And it became active all across the United States. By 1917, as the United States prepared to enter World War I, Salmon went to the US Army Surgeon General and convinced him that it was important for the US Army, before it went to war, to develop a mental health program that might prevent shell shock among the American Expeditionary Forces. Salmon's engagement of the Surgeon General and the military was proactive and population focused. And these were two characteristics of the mental hygiene movement to prevent whenever possible and to think at the population level. The military's acceptance of his offer was based on their understanding that shell shock had become the greatest drain on the fighting force across all nations engaged in the war. Shell shock accounted for 1/7 of all discharges for disability from the British Army, or 1/3 of all those discharges if physical wounds were excluded. So it was a major drain on the fighting force. In keeping with his charge, Salmon decided that he would go ahead of the American Expeditionary Forces to England to study what the British Army was doing and had been doing since 1914 in terms of shell shock. And this resulted in the publication of this this brief book that you can actually download, and I've given you, if you like, the link for it on your computer. It's titled "The Care and Treatment of Mental Diseases and War Neuroses, Shell Shock in the British Army," and it became a seminal work in combat stress control doctrine and for modern psychiatry. Now, when Salmon went to England, the prevailing view in the British Army was very much a biological one. Um, and that was led by Frederick Walker Mott, who, hold on a second, just to adjust my screen a bit. There we go. Frederick Walker Mott. And he helped found the famous Maudsley Hospital in London, which is still open and active today. Mott believed that shell shock was an organic disorder resulting from minute disturbances in the brain and spine, secondary to exposure either to blast injuries or to fumes that were collecting in the trenches. Uh, some of Mott's ideas echoed Erickson's 1867 conception of railway spine. Uh, a lot of people were involved in railway accidents in the early days of railroad building and development across Europe and America. And a disorder called railway spine was identified that involved a variety of nervous symptoms. And this was believed, at least by Erickson, to perhaps derive from sudden deceleration injuries to the nervous system. Mott applied that idea to shell shock. And his approach was aligned to Charcot and Genet's position that mental illness reflected a degenerative brain process in which the symptoms were triggered by traumatic stress, but you wouldn't have symptoms if there wasn't something wrong with your brain. Uh, the Maudsley Hospital, already under construction in World War I, actually opened as a military hospital under Mott's direction during the war. There were other voices in the British Army, and one of the important ones was W.H.R. Rivers. And he had a very different approach to shell shock. And some of you have probably read Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy of historical novels, which remember W.H. Rivers as a psychiatrist, an anthropologist, and an ethnologist. He was a very broad-based thinker and not a psychoanalyst, but someone who read Freud's ideas and was familiar with them and employed them when he thought they'd be useful. During World War I, he served at Craig Lockhart Psychiatric Hospital for British officers right outside of Edinburgh in Scotland. Rivers applied his anthropologist's eye, working on the wards with his patients to observe and decipher their symptoms and behaviors within the context of their military culture, their military ethics, and their combat experience, as well as the conflict between their civilian upbringing and their experiences in combat. From this perspective, he approached shell shock in human terms, not organic brain injury, but in terms of human behavior, human culture, and shared this understanding with his patients in therapeutic ways. And among his patients were the famous war poets Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, both of whom recovered under his care and went back into the war. when Salmon, this is an excerpt from Salmon's paper that I showed you earlier. Salmon really challenged Mott's prevailing biomedical approach to shell shock. This is a picture of a World War I shell shock patient. Uh, I think it's worth quoting this. Salmon writes, "The symptoms exhibited in shell shock usually bear a more direct relation to the existing psychological situation than they could possibly bear to the localization of a neurological injury. Thus, a soldier who bayonets an enemy in the face develops an hysterical tic of his own facial muscles. Abdominal contractures occur in men who have bayoneted enemies in the abdomen. Hysterical blindness follows particularly horrible sights. Hysterical deafness appears in those who find the cries of the wounded unbearable, and men detailed to burial parties develop anosmia, the inability to smell. The psychological basis of the war neuroses, like that of the neuroses in civil life, is an elaboration with endless variation of one central theme: escape from an intolerable situation in real life to the one made tolerable by the neurosis. In other words, shell shock isn't the problem in itself. Shell shock is the solution to the problem of being in an intolerable situation and needing a way out. It's interesting to note that Salmon's 1917 conclusion, and by the way, I've treated patients who've shown exactly the kind of psychologically related symptoms coming out of war, as Salmon described in 1917, more than a few. Uh, Salmon's 1917 conclusion was later echoed by Freud in his 1920 memorandum on the electrical treatment of war neurotics. And Freud wrote this as a formal response. It was a report written to a commission set up by the Austrian War Ministry to review accusations made against his colleague, Dr. Julius Werner Jahre. Werner Jahre had been accused of abusing Austrian and German shell shock soldiers by giving them very painful electric shocks, applying more and more powerful shocks until their symptoms went away. Freud did criticize Werner Jahre's methods, but he exonerated him of torturing people, saying that Werner Jahre was clearly following a therapeutic aim of making the treatment worse than the disorder, and thus shifting the dynamic of shell shock and escape from an intolerable situation by making shell shock the intolerable situation, shifting them toward health. Werner Jahre went on to win the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1927 for a different series of research. He eventually joined the Nazi Party. Nobody's sweetheart. I want to bring you back to Salmon's principles for the treatment of shell shock that he developed starting in 1917, and they developed through experience and, frankly, luck. But his ability to observe what was working and not working, and to continue to evolve his approach over time. And I'm more or less paraphrasing his language here. Salmon recommended holistic appraisal of specific incidents, general circumstances, as well as lifelong personality and adaptive style that he said comprised the presentation of each individual soldier. This is not a mass treatment that could be just applied to everybody on a conveyor belt. You had to know the individual and understand what had happened, who they were, what their normal coping mechanisms were like in order to treat them at all. It required a balance of understanding sympathy, but also firm control within a strong military cultural context. The fact is that these folks were treated not as patients, but as soldiers, or for that matter, Marines, sailors. The bottom line is this was done within the military culture, and it was important to do so because the idea was to normalize as much as possible their experience as being part of the military experience, and that their military culture Just as their military training had prepared them for war, that training and that culture could pull them through. Salmon also said it required the judicious use of persuasion, a word we're going to come back to later. For instance, Salmon said that hypnotism could be useful in demonstrating to the patient he had not lost neurological function. As we'll see in World War II, hypnosis can be very helpful for a person who is suffering from paralysis, a person who can't speak, a person who can't remember. By convincing the person under hypnosis, or demonstrating to the person under hypnosis, you really can walk, you really can move that limb, you really can remember, but you haven't been able to. We will help you with that. In those days, hydrotherapy and electrotherapy, like Foner Yard was using, Salmon said, can be effective when applied with absolute sincerity. I think what Salmon meant by this is he didn't believe that hydrotherapy, putting people in baths or giving them shocks, had any direct, specific biological effect. But if you told the people it would work and you told them with great sincerity, it would work in many cases. And that was true. An attitude, he said, of positive expectancy must pervade the therapeutic relationship and the entire hospital program, that you treat people with expectancy that they're going to do well. And, 100 years later, these are still the basis for combat stress control, not just for Americans, but all over the world. And the simplest expression of this, it's been modified over time. People like to change things around, but the essence has never changed. Treat people with great proximity to the front. Don't take them home and expect them to get better because they're home and safe. In fact, people do better when you treat them within the sound of the guns. Don't take them all the way back from the front. Keep them near the front. Treat them with immediacy. Don't wait for them to completely break down. When they develop the 1,000-yard stare, when they're already having trouble playing poker with their friends or laughing at a joke, when they're withdrawing to themselves, that's when you begin the treatment. And treat them with that positive expectancy. When applied in Iraq and Afghanistan during our recent wars there was a 97% return to duty rate among American forces using this model. Now, the war ended in 1918, and by the war's end, although the American troops had much less incidents of shell shock applying Salmon's model, there were still plenty of people who broke down. Now, there were over 2 million Americans who served in Europe during World War I. At the end of the war, 4,000 of them were psychiatrically hospitalized in France at the end of the war. And the fact is, there was no military hospital system or VA hospital system ready to receive them when they returned to the US. On that basis, Salmon petitioned to Congress to create what is now our Veterans Administration, Department of Veterans Affairs. What you see here is in 1918, building the building that becomes the headquarters of the Department of Veterans Affairs. It's one block from the White House, showing it's a very important building for our government. In fact, I worked in this building for a number of years. My office is one of the buildings that doesn't have facing on it yet, but I can spot it. I can spot where my window was going to be. It took Congress 2 years to agree to build that veterans hospital system. By that time, the number of American veterans who required hospitalization had doubled to 8,000. And by the time these hospitals were built, and it took a few years, they were built with 12,000 psychiatric hospital beds and all those beds filled. And those that couldn't get out of those hospitals were living by the roadside, were in jails, were in asylums all over America. There were many more who couldn't even get to those hospitals. 1920, the year that Congress approved building the VA system, was also the year that Freud published an important revision of his dream theory. Here's a quote from Freud. "This would seem to be the place, then, at which to admit for the first time an exception to the proposition that dreams are fulfillments of wishes," following what Freud called the pleasure principle. Freud had to admit in writing, it is impossible to classify as wish fulfillments the dreams we've been discussing, which occur in traumatic neuroses. And he is speaking specifically about the dreams of World War I veterans. 1920 was a catastrophic period for Freud and everyone in his sphere. Not only were they dealing with the aftermath of World War I, but also the pandemic that accompanied it, 1918, 1919. In fact, there's been a lot of scholarship lately on the fact that Freud's daughter, who was pregnant at the time, died of the pandemic shortly before he wrote or completed Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And to what extent did that add to his concerns about combat veterans? Again, the term pleasure principle refers to the psychological tendency to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Freud believed that was a governing principle of the psyche. And of course, he thought dreams were fulfillments of wishes. That's what our sleeping brains were doing, trying to solve problems through wish fulfillment. But Beyond the Pleasure Principle was inspired by the fact that he could not make the dreams of World War I veterans, the nightmares, into wish fulfillments. Instead, he understood them as a compulsion to repeat traumatic memories, not resolve them, but repeat them. They had been pushed beyond the pleasure principle, hence the name of the book. And he suggested that this repetition compulsion was an effort to bind trauma through a process of fixation. The veteran was fixated on the trauma in the hopes that that fixation, that concentration on it, might lead to a resolution, work its way through. You could think of this as a sort of protective psychic plot meant to seal a tear in the mind. It's an imperfect solution because this kind of fixation on trauma is also likely to become a significant problem in itself. I want to follow with you Freud's thinking about, well, what's really going on here? And Freud invites us in Beyond the Pleasure Principle to consider a thought experiment. Think of a primitive organism, a single cell, floating in a primordial sea, with no significant specialization of either its inner or outer components. It's very vulnerable. It's a naked blob of protoplasm floating around. And its upper half is being exposed to the sun. Its lower half is submerged in salt water, which might also contain competing organisms wanting to take bites of it. And as such, it's incredibly vulnerable to stimulation and injury. It's also susceptible to stimulation from its inner environment, hunger, metabolic stress, the need to reproduce, and other internal tensions. What Freud suggests is that over time, as the outermost layer is modified by its interaction with its environment, it toughens up, whether it's the sun baking the top or the salt water toughening it. It's kind of like the skin on a pudding. And Freud suggests through this metaphor that living things develop a protective surface, a protective shield that enables efficient life process in the face of external stress. This is where we get the term stimulus barrier. And this works unless it's breached by overwhelming stimulation. And Freud defines trauma as a psychological trauma as a breach in the stimulus barrier, which results in a flooding of the organism with overwhelming stimulation, a term he calls traumatic anxiety. At that point, when the stimulus barrier is overwhelmed and in tatters, it has to fall back on a different, frankly, more primitive set of defenses. It can't use fantasy, wish fulfillment, reliance on memories of better times. Instead, basically, it hits its head against the wall of trauma in an effort to somehow break through it, or at least survive it, to confront it and wrestle with it. Unfortunately, that often tends out to be fruitless. This can lead to hysterical symptoms such as dissociation and conversion, as part of the defensive repression of traumatic memories, which even in the aftermath of trauma, the person can't bear remembering or thinking about. Salmon's description of how repressed memories can become symbolized within symptoms illustrates how a new psychological balance, not a good one, but a new one, can be reached between remembering and not remembering traumatic experiences. They're not exactly remembered, but they are carried, symbolized in the body as stigmata. So I use this illustration, this fairy tale illustration of the wolf at the door, perhaps of the Three Little Pigs, if you know that fairy tale. Um, you know, in the normal situation, there is a secure door to keep the wolf from getting inside. Uh, and um, and under normal circumstances, uh, the door serves as reliable protection against external stressor. Uh, Under these conditions, a modulated level of anxiety functions as a subtle symptom. Think of the wolf knocking on the door. Well, that's modulating the danger outside. And that knock on the door flexibly mobilizes defenses, mature defenses. So you can say, well, I'm going to bar the door now and keep that wolf out. However, if the wolf manages to break through the door, if the door is knocked off its hinges, there's no way to keep the outside out, or for that matter, the inside in. And this is what Freud meant by traumatic anxiety. With the stimulus barrier broken through, anxiety floods the psyche and overwhelms its ability to flexibly mobilize effective defenses. One can think of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as an expression of this state. Of course, it's just one of many possible post-traumatic disorders. I'll mention that during World War II, psychiatrists around the world employed something Salmon recommended, hypnosis, as well as sodium amytal. You're seeing a picture of a real psychiatrist, an army psychiatrist, a real patient. This is a hypnotic session. Using hypnosis or amytal to recover repressed memories during an altered state created by the drug or by hypnosis, and then helping the patient realize that you're not paralyzed, you don't really have a problem remembering, you just have not been able to remember because it's all part of something you've been repressing. It was more than you could manage at the time, but now you're safe. These treatments really worked. They worked miraculously. If you wanted to, there is a 1946 US Army psychiatric training film called Let There Be Light that you can download. It was top secret for 50 years, but now if you Google Let There Be Light Army training film, you can watch hypnosis, sodium amytal with real doctors, real patients, and see it work. And it was so powerful that it actually led to the spread of American psychiatry. Most medical schools did not have departments of psychiatry before World War II, but every one of them wanted one after this. And by the same token, because this was a psychoanalytic idea, that if you overcome the repression of memory, you can overcome symptoms. This led to the dominance of psychoanalysis in America for the next 30 years. There were, however, psychiatrists, World War II Army psychiatrists, who weren't ready to totally embrace psychoanalysis. One of them was Jerome Frank. And Frank said, look, I want to understand what really happens in healing of all sorts. And he saw these hypnotic sessions and amytal sessions. Maybe you're just, recovering repressed memory, but is this a ritual? And is this a ritual like rituals all over the world in all kinds of societies, and in the middle of Borneo, as well as in hospital clinics? And Frank came to believe, based on his study across cultures, that healing practices restore morale in people. It didn't matter what the healing practice was. The way it worked was by restoring morale in people who had come to lack a sense of inner freedom, self-efficacy, and satisfaction with life. He understood psychological trauma as a paradigm for the loss of morale. but morale could be restored within and through the therapeutic relationship. And Frank suggests that literally all frames we have for psychotherapy are simply different methods of establishing that healing relationship, whether we're working cognitively, behaviorally, that ultimately the relationship plays a huge role. And I certainly believe that. It's not that I don't think behavioral principles make sense or cognitive principles make sense, but the relational issues we know from research help determine outcomes, are an important determinant across diagnoses and across forms of treatment. Now, I want to take you to Donald Winnicott and his views. Winnicott was working during World War II, doing a series of up to 50 BBC radio broadcasts for parents trying to help their kids get through the Blitz in London and other cities in England. And he was very much involved as a child. He had been a pediatrician who became an analyst and a child analyst. And he writes here in 1940, war in Europe already on for 2 years. There is no such thing. I once said there is no such thing as an infant, meaning, of course, that whenever one finds an infant, one finds maternal care. No, there are no babies without mothers, or parents at least, right? And without maternal care, there wouldn't be an infant. And Winnicott goes on to wonder if maybe in making that statement, he had been influenced by something Freud had said. And here's that footnote that Winnicott was alluding to. Freud basically says, look, it'd be rightly objected that an organization, a mental organization, which was slave to the pleasure principle, which only operated on the idea that, hey, I can fantasize my way out of a problem, and neglected reality of the external world, couldn't possibly remain alive for very long. In other words, you can't just close your eyes and walk out into traffic. There has to be something else here. The pleasure principle by itself isn't enough. But Freud didn't spend much time following up on this idea. Winnicott did. And this is where his idea of the holding environment takes off. I'm using this diagram to kind of illustrate what I think Winnicott really meant by this. And it's hard not to fall back on Winnicott's flair for language. And here he focuses on maternal care. We want to be clear, we're talking about mothers, fathers, and other important caretakers. This diagram represents the child in the inner white circle, living within its parents' protective care. Beyond the parents' protective care is the surrounding environment, which hopefully is pretty benign, but may include lots and lots of stressors. At first, the child entirely lives within that protection and care because it's not yet capable of managing its own interface with the environment. And what kind of parent do you need here? Here it's useful to say a few words about Winnicott's concept, the good enough mother. A good enough mother is going to be careful to expose her child, will be careful to expose her child, not to expose her child, missing word here. A good enough mother will be careful not to expose her child to more stimulus than it can bear. But neither will she shield her child from every stimulus, threat, or anxiety. By allowing the child to experience the world in manageable doses, letting it feel some stress and some anxiety, letting the child fall down on the playground and skin its knee, but then comfort it when it comes back and says, look at my knee, this hurts. In doing this, she nurtures the child's growing autonomy, their capacity to be alone, and the child's faith that, yes, I may feel pain, anxiety, frustration, I may be injured, but I can bear it and I can manage it. Success in this vital process of parenting depends on the parent's ability to understand what is a manageable level of anxiety, disappointment, and pain for a particular child at a particular point in development. Every child's different. Fonagy talks about the parent's ability to do this well as keeping a child's mind in mind, or he uses the term mentalization. A parent who understands their child and can see their child as a separate person with their own needs can meet those needs if they themselves are in pretty good shape. Now, here's a picture of a woman who is not a good enough mother. And here's a very wealthy woman. She's got a teenage son. He's in a wheelchair. And the caption says, well, of course he can walk, but thank God he doesn't have to. This is, according to the joke, a mother who hasn't allowed her child to skin his knee. She's taking pains to make sure he never skins his knee. And now you've got a child who can't even walk on his own, who can't be on his own. That is not the kind of parenting we're talking about. So let's skip to another idea of Winnicott's, an essential idea, and that is the holding environment. Winnicott believed that over time, the child comes to live in what I describe here as the blue zone. It's a zone between the child, the parent, and the external world. This holding environment can be thought of as a consolidation of what Winnicott called transitional space between mother and child. Winnicott conceived of transitional space as a zone in which fantasy and reality overlap. It serves as a progressively organizing playground in which the child creatively and practically hones its skill in coping with needs and frustrations, both external ones as well as internal ones. I'm hungry, I'm lonely. It's in this space that the child begins to develop skill and confidence in mastering its environment, external and internal. And in order to get to this stage, it needs the protection of a parent. It needs the modeling of a parent. It needs the reassurance that pain and anxiety can be tolerated before it can begin to assume the management of those problems. So this takes place between the child's inner world and the outer world. It's contributed to by both. It's within this transitional space that transitional objects, another Winnicott term, like security blankets and teddy bears, play such an important role because these are real material objects that exist in the real world, but they're infused with the powers and properties of the parents and caregivers who provided these objects to the child. So they are stamped with the parents' powers, abilities. At the same time, they're under the magical control of the child's creative process and ready to provide safety and security at the child's command whenever needed. Through the use of transitional objects, practicing managing reality for yourself through the combination of both fantasy and practical measures, a child becomes progressively able to be autonomous, to make it through the world on their own, to trust the world, to trust themselves, to trust other people. The cognitive psychologist Ronnie Janoff Pullman conceptualized psychological trauma as a disruption of exactly those abilities, those basic assumptions about oneself as being reasonably capable and worth preserving, other people as being basically good and dependable, and the world as being a meaningful and benevolent place. You know, the fact is the world really a meaningful and benevolent place? I think it kind of depends on a lot of factors. Sometimes it definitely is not. Sometimes other people can't be trusted. Sometimes you yourself are not up to the tasks you're faced with. Uh, when that becomes overwhelming, that is psychological trauma. Now, based on this review, I would like to suggest that Freud's conceptual stimulus barrier really is the product of the child's successful internalization of the holding environment. The holding environment is no longer existing in the presence only of the parent, but the child has created this level of safety, this barrier against stress for itself, and completely internalizes it. The child no longer thinks of the parents at all in this sense. They have managed to incorporate this. It's part of what they are. The stimulus barrier is now the child's personal attribute, but it remains tinged with a bit of the parental color to remind us that it originated within the parent's care and will always carry unique traces of their protective capacities and their vulnerabilities. Frankly, I've often wondered if this is why, in the heat of combat, grown men will sometimes call for their mothers, that you can regress to the point where you no longer feel capable or competent, and whether your mother's alive or dead, whether she's, available to you, you'll fall back on your earliest protective mechanisms when all else has failed. Now, all of this, I hope, will be helpful to you. It's been invaluable for me because when I sit in the room with combat veterans, I can't help but try to understand what is broken here. What is the problem that they're bringing, and that's brought them to see me? And they're usually not happy to see a psychiatrist, but something has driven them to do that. This helps me understand their symptoms, their perspectives on life, their relationships, and their interactions with me within the therapeutic setting. The vital capacities that they have, even their sense of time, predictability in the world, patience, trust in themselves, trust in other people, a sense of meaningfulness and purpose and benevolence in the world. This is precisely what's been disrupted by psychological trauma. This is precisely what their parents and they worked so hard to develop in their early years, and which they tried so hard then to make portable and use for themselves as they went out into the world. This can be broken. This can be torn out by the roots. And of course, the question is, what do you do then? I want to also emphasize that Winnicott thought of the holding environment of transitional space in terms of creativity. It is a place where the child plays with reality and develops a stronger sense of reality through practice and play. That creative ability is never entirely outgrown, and it may in fact be the domain in which psychotherapy operates. Now, with this history and all this theory in mind, what can be done? What can we recommend to support the recovery of trauma survivors, including combat veterans? Arik Shalev, who many of you may know, professor originally out of Israel, Hadassah Hospital in Israel, now based in the US, provided unique survival advice for Ukrainian civilians in a fairly recent article, 2022, in which he says, look, the first priority is to survive, and when possible, protect others from a broad range of stressors. Survivors must deal with the inescapable life change, loss, uncertainty in the present and about the future. And exposure to suffering, hunger, the elements, death, and destruction. Easier said than done, but this is what must be done. It's important to remember that human beings are not passive in the face of stress. It is a human quality, an innate human quality, to immediately begin to fight back, to adapt, and take whatever control they can over circumstances. Yes, they can be overwhelmed, but this is also normal in human beings to fight back. And this response is spontaneous because it's the nature of human beings to be resilient. So, what should survivors do? They should do their best to stay safe to the extent that they can. They should keep informed. They should establish routines that they can depend on in a world that otherwise has become undependable and chaotic. They should identify material and psychological resources that will maintain them. They should maintain ongoing assessment of their environment and planning and prediction. They should maintain and nurture attachment to others. They should not allow themselves to be isolated. They should, in fact, look out for others. In war, Shalev says, nothing helps more than helping others. And we see this in disaster. We see it in war. We see the opposite sometimes too. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, but this would be the healthy way to get through a situation that otherwise would be difficult to tolerate. And I want to point out that these recommendations actually mirror core dimensions of safety, security, and meaning that went into those early experiences of holding, and which call on the kind of creativity that originally enabled the development and maintenance of a stimulus barrier. This is all maintaining, if you can, your stimulus barrier or patching it where it's been broken. So Shalev concludes, if that's where we are, then regardless of geography and relocation, we're okay. And when the stark winter of war ends, we will emerge, perhaps with scars, but not with bleeding wounds. Peace enables us a reasonable survival. War offers honorable survival, and it is reachable and within us to obtain. It is, I think, honest and realistic, a little rosy here and there, but frankly, pretty good advice. I don't know better, and that's why I'm sharing it with you. I want to share just a moment about the idea of resilience. Resilience is a word that gets used a lot, and it's not clear what people mean or what they expect of people in terms of being resilient. For me, resilience implies that things that were stretched out of shape by stress could ultimately go back into their original shape. Um, Very much like a spring that's been stretched and released. It goes back to its original shape and maintains its original properties. However, by definition, trauma is not stress. Trauma is not like stress on a spring, pulling it out and letting it go back into shape. Trauma can be thought of metaphorically, a spring that has been stretched to its maximum and then twisted out of shape. If you ever had a toy slinky we have in America, a toy spring that a child plays with, and at some point the child will almost always say, I wonder how far I can stretch this thing. What would happen if I twisted it like that? And then they see the toy is now broken. It's never going to work the same way again. That's trauma. That deformed spring is not going to return to its original shape, and it's not going to respond to stress the way it did originally either. It's not going to bend and open the same way or spring back into shape the same way. By the same token, I don't think a trauma survivor can expect to return to their original state. I think the best that can be achieved is a new balance and a new state. I want to be clear. I'm not saying trauma can't be dealt with. I'm not saying that people are doomed if they've been traumatized, but neither are they going to be the way they were before the trauma. And I think too many people, the survivors and their clinicians, are busy trying to get them to be back the way they were without recognizing that something essential has been changed. And what's needed now is a new balance, not an old way of being restored, but a new balance. I think a lot of the frustration about treating trauma, both for patients, clinicians, and families, is, well, why can't he be like he was before? I think instead one has to understand why he is the way he is now, why he became the way he is now. And it's not just that he's broken, but he has adapted. This is something Carl Castro, I think, a principle of what was called battle mind that Carl helped develop in the US Army during our recent wars, that you can adapt to anything, but you have adapted. And when you're out of the danger situation, you might find you're still adapted to the danger situation. And this can be a problem when you get home. So, what are the implications for psychotherapy in the wake of trauma? Well, the first step in psychotherapy, and the hardest, is to establish trust. And it's going to take time. And it's hard for us as psychotherapists. We like to think we're trustworthy people and that we're likable people and we're competent people, and therefore our patients will trust us. And in most cases, outside of trauma people, people can establish some level of trust pretty early. But that's not so much the case with traumatized people. And this tends, understandably, to be a slow and very difficult process, both for the patient and the therapist in the aftermath of trauma. Challenging thoughts and feelings like despair and rage and hate and guilt and incompetence and wishes to avoid or withdraw, among others, are very likely to emerge in both patient and therapist. And the therapist has to realize that they may feel these feelings too if they're actually going to open themselves to deeper work with patients who have been traumatized. Frankly, any work with patients who are traumatized. Because psychotherapy recapitulates developmental steps which first establish the stimulus barrier, significant give and take is required before an effective therapeutic relationship can emerge. And even then, it's going to be tested over and over. And it's going to be tested in some very hard ways. So what are the core challenges? It's going to require special attention to initial engagement and the extreme complexities of transference and countertransference. What is the patient projecting on the therapist? For that matter, what is the therapist projecting back on the patient? Partly in response to the patient's projections, you're saying I'm untrustable. That makes me feel like maybe you don't like me, which makes me feel like maybe I need to get further away from you. I don't like people who don't like me. I mean, there's a zillion possibilities, right? Depending on each individual and how they confront one another. Almost inevitably, these feelings are going to be encountered and worked with survivors. The therapist will likely find that he or she brings that trauma home at the end of the day and awakens to it, especially on days of the patient's appointments. I know I've certainly woken up and looked in the mirror and said, which tie should I wear? And then I think, well, I'm going to see that guy today. I don't want to look like this. I want to look like that. And wonder, well, why am I choosing my tie based on the patient I'm going to see? What's going on between me and that patient? What am I trying to prove? It's a good exercise to go through. I'll still pick the tie that I think they'll like. Both patient and therapist are going to need to prove good enough to tolerate, manage, and ultimately work through the fundamental challenges of psychological trauma. Lack of exposure to psychoanalytic principles, which I think is pretty widespread in the last 20 years. People aren't always trained in these principles, so they don't really have a language, a conceptual framework to think about, well, what is trauma and what's going on in this patient and what are they evoking in me? What's going on in me? That creates a danger of not perceiving what I call countertransferential pressure on the therapist to achieve significant improvement, to save the day, which can result in feelings of frustration and incompetence on the part of the therapist, which can be part of a downhill struggle for patient and therapist for the therapy. As an example of countertransference pressure, very often therapists feel a very strong pull to say, I understand. You just told me a horrible story. I understand. I understand what happened. But it's likely that hearing this, the patient will conclude that the therapist really doesn't understand and is whitewashing over, is just brushing past, doesn't want to deal with what they heard, what the patient just said. The fact is, genuine empathy requires following the patient into experiences that may defy understanding and being able to be there with the patient in that place. It doesn't require a speech in either direction by the therapist. It requires following the patient and being with them in much the way that parents were with the child all through their developing life. I think the best lesson I ever learned about this was from Sarah Haley. She passed away some years ago. I had a chance to present a case to her when I was a resident, though, of a combat veteran from Vietnam. Sarah Haley wrote an amazing article, which I really recommend you read. It's called When the Patient Reports Atrocities, Specific Treatment Considerations of the Vietnam Veteran, and it applies to veterans of all wars. It reflected her experience as a clinical social worker in a VA medical center in Boston, here in the US. She was seeing lots of Vietnam veterans, and nobody trained her what to do or what to expect or how to deal with things. And she said, look, based on her experience, you have to sensitively demonstrate uh, the importance of, well, she sensitively demonstrated the importance of managing your own countertransference and working with combat veterans in order to prevent the therapist from running away from the patient, abandoning them out of resentment or out of horror. There are things that people can tell you that you don't want to hear or know or believe could happen in the world. And you're only human if you want to run away at that moment. But you're the therapist and you can't. You're going to have to find a way to be there. You have to enable the therapist to understand core elements of the patient's intrapsychic struggles, which are central to their mental health problems and instrumental to their treatment, but which the patient cannot yet directly articulate. And you have to be there to help that be articulated progressively. I also want to mention the work of Wilfred Bion. More and more people are talking about Bion's work in trauma and his concept of containment, was probably informed by his horrific experience. Here you see him as a combat veteran of World War One, and then he was an important psychiatrist in World War II treating combat veterans. And it helps inform the therapeutic function in trauma. Beyond interpretation, beyond SET, the therapist assists the patient in a fundamental way by serving as a container for memories and meanings which the patient hasn't yet been able to manage for him or herself. Over time, the patient sensed that the therapist can survive these things leads to a sense of being contained by the therapist, which eventually empowers the patient to progressively be able to confront and contain things for themselves. Again, you see the recapitulation of early development here. I want to be clear, it's not that the therapist says, oh, I'm fine with that. I can handle that. I know all about that. It's okay for the therapist to sit on the edge of their chair, not play acting. If you're really listening, there'll be times you will sit on the edge of your chair. There'll be times when you will visibly be affected, and the patient will see that. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't play act it, but you don't disguise it. You have to show the patient you really heard them, but that you didn't run out of the room screaming. You didn't abandon them. You didn't criticize them the way, frankly, many of them expect to be criticized. How could you have done that? How could you have allowed that? Why are you still alive when that comrade you described is dead? They expect you to say that. The fact that you don't is in itself therapeutic. This isn't to say that the patient won't nonetheless attack the therapist's peace of mind in order to test their integrity. Are you really listening? Do you really care? Can you handle, you seem to be able to handle that. Can you handle this? They have to check you out in order to be sure that it's safe for them to bring themselves fully into the therapy. And you do not have to be superhuman. You just have to hang in there. You just have to show, I'm here for you. This isn't easy work for either of us, but let's keep going. It's not going too far to say that this therapeutic process takes place within transitional space. Transitional space doesn't evaporate when you're grown up. It's with us all the time. We all slip into it, whether we hum a favorite song or we think about a favorite memory or we fantasize about being on the beach in the middle of a boring day. We're in transitional space. We daydream in transitional space. It provides a moment of safety and a place to breathe. And in doing so, we are constantly recapitulating the development of a holding environment of the stimulus pattern. So to go back to Freud, and we're almost done. To go back to Freud, in his last major work, Analysis Terminable and Interminable, Freud returned to the problem of psychological trauma and concluded that, the best that can be achieved through therapy is not plucking out the trauma. If you remember, in 1895, studies on hysteria, they used the metaphor that maybe hypnosis can be used as a psychological forceps, which can pluck a traumatic memory out of a person and allow them to return to health. Here, Freud says that's not going to happen. But what can be achieved is a new, more workable psychological balance. Now, Freud's translator, Strachey, says, well, this is Freud's pessimism. Doesn't he think that people can really get better? But I think this is just Freud's honesty and his life experience and his experience as a therapist and as a thinker, that you can't change the past. You can't erase a memory. You can't turn a terrible, overwhelming experience into a good one, but you can rebalance the dynamics. That person will be permanently different, but they can come into a new balance, and that is a significant accomplishment. That is actually optimism. It's not perfection, but if all goes well, the survivor will leave therapy with a restored, if reset, capacity for inner peace, for agency, and stable, satisfying relationships with other people and with oneself, which is exactly what the holy environment originally provided. At this point, the work of psychotherapy can be said to have been completed. Hopefully, life going forward will function as a good co-therapist. But if not, psychotherapy is still available and become an option for the next phase of work. So in closing, Winnicott compared the transitional space of early life with the therapeutic situation the work that you're doing with your patients, in which the worlds of the patient and the therapist come to overlap. Echoing Freud's concept about transference, and I'll add countertransference, has to be admitted into what he called the psychoanalytic playground. That's Freud's phrase, the psychoanalytic playground, and Winnicott echoes it, in which it is allowed to expand. This is Freud's words, the psychoanalytic playground, in which these memories, the transfers to countertransference, are allowed to expand in almost complete freedom, and in which they're expected to display to us, the therapist, everything in the way of pathogenic instincts that's hidden in the patient's minds. It's not just an intellectual pursuit of memory and plucking it out. It has to be relived in real time. And the therapeutic setting creates the environment where that can happen in a safe and therapeutic way, helpful way. Psychotherapy is capable of promoting recovery from psychological trauma, and it does it by recapitulating early development through creative reconstruction of transitional space. This is always available, all through life. While this can't restore the original state of the psyche, it may provide the foundation for new and even more enduring psychological structures and capacities. And I want to end with this quote. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov was a Hasidic master who lived in what is now Ukraine from 1772 to 1810. And he's often quoted by saying that the entire world is a narrow bridge, and the essential thing is not to be afraid. And I've struggled with that because I don't know how you can not be afraid. And I certainly know that most of the people I've spoken with who have been to war do not talk about not being afraid. They were afraid. But I recently read a new translation that I want to share with you. The entire world is a narrow bridge, and the essential thing is not to become paralyzed by fear. You can be afraid, but the essential thing is not to become paralyzed. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck on that bridge your whole life, neither going forward nor being able to go backward. And that, I think, is what psychological trauma does to people. If psychological trauma renders the survivor paralyzed by intrusive memories, flashbacks, hypervigilance, avoidance of reminders, associated changes in cognition and mood, reflecting fears and doubts, and even feelings of shame and betrayal, in the wake of negation of their most basic assumptions about self and others and the safety and benevolence and meaningfulness of the world, then the function of effective therapy, any effective therapy, must be to assist the survivor in relying on her or his own agency and reclaiming the right to pursue their own path and progress in their own path forward in life. At that point, the survivor will no longer require the